So, welcome to everybody. We are talking today to Lord Peter Hain, who's written this very intriguing book, A Pretoria Boy, The Story of South Africa's Public Enemy Number One. So perhaps I want to ask you to start with, Peter. You've written all sorts of books, including a novel recently, The Rhino Conspiracy, which is terrific, by the way. So the question I'm intrigued is, why at this point did you decide to sit down and write a book about your youth and everything that occurred in relation to South Africa?
Partly because I got to know the managing director of Jonathan Ball Publishers, Eugene Ashton, who's a former Pretoria Boys High student himself. And we got chatting, and I just thought South Africans suddenly found me in 2718 popping up as a British Lord, many of them, particularly the younger generation, not having a clue that I was actually brought up in Pretoria, the son of anti-apartheid activists. And it seemed correct to tell the story from that early journey as a boy in South Africa, in Pretoria, all the way through to exposing the Guptas and the Zuma family in using parliamentary privilege. And so really that's how the idea came, that a lot of South Africans below the age of 60, 70 and above didn't know anything about my hinterland and wondered why on earth. And when I popped up on news bulletins having exposed the Guptas and the international money laundering and the complicity of the global corporates, there were tweets from various people saying, who is this white colonial figure, and so on. So I thought it would be a good idea if anybody was interested, but fortunately there seemed to be, because it seems to be selling well, in the full story.
And just out of interest, was it sort of like, I suppose, going back, because the book really starts with your childhood, was this almost a voyage of discovery of yourself? As you have to put this down in writing, does it sort of recall both the pain and the exhilaration of so much that took place in regard to South Africa in which you were involved?
Yes, it did, and it does. And I remain enormously proud of my late parents, not just for being fantastic parents in the middle of the house being raided and being arrested and both being issued with banning orders. They were the first married couple to be banned, actually, and there was a funny side to that. Amidst the siege and the sense of pressure that we were under, that nevertheless there was a normal kind of white boyhood there in Pretoria of playing cricket and a bit of rugby, but mainly soccer and bike races, and just you'll know yourself, Dennis, of the upbringing you had. It was apartheid apart, and when I was unique amongst my cousins and my school friends of having black friends in the house, knowing the conditions, going with my parents into townships like Attridgeville and Mamelodi, for example, to see what was actually happening. So it was this combination of what I describe in The Pretoria Boy as normality for a white boy, and at the same time abnormality, because there are only a tiny, tiny percentage of whites who actually did stand up against the evil of apartheid. And I'm always proud that my mom and dad were amongst them.
So let me just ask about your mom and dad. And the reason I ask is because when I read this book, I recalled passages in Dikgang Mosaneki's book, where he talks about this kindly white woman who, when he was 15 years old and he was in trial, it's incredibly moving. He doesn't initially disclose who it is, who came to court every day and provided him, I think, with some refreshment, and was incredibly supportive in this hostile court. And then it turned out that when she spoke to him, it was your mom who had a son who was roughly the same age as Dikgang. And I was intrigued by that because you're right, there were so few people of the white community who were in that sort of cohort. What was it that actually inspired your parents? You're right, the vast majority of parents who would have sent their children to Pretoria school would have hardly been in the same political bent. Now, I knew some of those older people who were in the Liberal Party. I was very friendly with Gerald Gordon, who was in the Cape part of the Liberal Party, but there were very few. What was it about your parents that, in a sense, gave them this Weltanschauung, which they then inspired you with?
First of all, the Dikhang Mukanesi issue in the anecdote was extraordinary because my mom never knew what became of him, and he never knew that I was her son. He'd heard of me, and I'd of course heard of him, but neither knew until 2012, when I was making a documentary for the BBC on the Marikana massacre, and in the course of my research, the fact that he was the young 15-year-old in short pants on trial in Pretoria. And my mum used to almost haunt the courts and go and help young defendants, especially, and their parents discover who they were. As to why my mum and dad, my mum was born in Port Alfred, my dad was born in Durban. They had ordinary white South African backgrounds. As to why they, alone amongst their relatives, their brothers and sisters, only my mom's younger sister aunt got involved in Grahamstown. My aunt Jo, who's still alive and may even be part of this webinar. And I continuously asked them this question because I wrote a book called Adelaide and Walter Hain, published in 2014, about their story. Because my story was a bit known in Britain, but theirs wasn't. And I kept asking them why. And it's quite puzzling. It had to do, in my dad's case, I think, an awakening during the Second World War. He fought in the Italian campaign for the Royal Natal Carbineers in the South African Army. My mum was always a bit, amongst her 7 brothers and sisters, a bit kind of sort of quite feisty and politically quite interested. But there's nothing really to explain in their background how they gradually got absorbed, but they did into the struggle, to the point in the 1960s, just to end, when in the 1960s, when the ANC had been banned, Mandela and the leadership were on Robben Island, the PAC had been banned, the Congress of Democrats had been banned. The Liberal Party of South Africa was the only party committed to true non-racial future, universal franchise. Helen Suzman, fantastic warrior against apartheid though she was, and deserves to be saluted for that. The Progressive Party never was part of that struggle.
Yeah, they came from the United Party, you're right.
Yeah, and they believed in a qualified franchise and so forth. So Mum and Dad found themselves as the 2 most notorious activists in Pretoria, the citadel of apartheid, in that period from around 1960 to when we were forced into exile in 1966. But, as to why it was them, rather than any of their brothers and sisters or cousins or in-laws or, peers, that's a much more difficult question to answer.
Yeah, because it's, and just out of interest, did they discuss politics with you?
Yes.
As a young person? I mean, did you, as it were, inherit their particular perspective because they actually were open with you about what the hell was going on? Whereas many of us were very protected from this. Somehow it was only when I had a wonderful school teacher who taught us Cry the Beloved Country when I was 14 that my eyes started to open to the sheer horrors of it all.
Yes, and the journeys of white anti-apartheid activists such as yours and my very close friend Andre Oudendal, Professor Andre Oudendal, brilliant sport and other historian. His journey from Afrikaner apartheid supporting family hinterland in Queenstown to joining the struggle and taking part in the anti-Gatting tour demonstrations and so forth. I mean, that's a more extraordinary journey than mine in a sense, because I just imbibed my parents' values and anti-apartheid politics.
Yeah, he had to transcend, yeah.
Yes, and you did, and many others did. Ronnie Casseroles did. You look at all the heroic figures of the struggle in the white community. Many of them, some were the sons and daughters of white activists, but many were not. So in my case, I grew up with it. I grew up that was the normal way to behave, that, you didn't treat anybody with a different color skin differently. I remember, and I tell the story in my book, about one black activist coming into our house for a meeting and saying it was the first time in his life he'd walked through the front door of a white person's house. It was usually as a domestic worker through the back door. So in that sense, it was part of my DNA from a very young age, and I was proud of them. There were never any arguments. I never felt, for example, when I was woken up in the middle of the night, aged 11, to be told they'd been put in jail, the first to be arrested under the 12-day detention, without trial law, which then became, as you know, 90 days, 180 days, and then indefinite. I never thought, why are my parents abandoning me? I thought, right, I've got to get on and try and help at home and support them. So that was the culture I was brought up in.
And the culture of the school, I mean, they must have known, parents, presumably of the kids must have known that you were coming from a somewhat unusual family. I accept that you claim Pretoria Boys High is one of the great schools in the world, and I'm not going to dispute that with you. I know it's...
I should hope not, Dennis.
Well, it's produced a lot of extraordinary people. I mean, there's you, there's Elon Musk, there's Edwin Cameron, and all those sports people like Eddie Varner, etc. But what I suppose I'm asking is, when you were there, I'm just intrigued, did the school and the teachers, you sort of seem to suggest that some of them were quite sympathetic to you in some ways.
Principally, yes. My English teacher, my favorite teacher,
yes.
And somebody who, when I was interviewed for a newspaper column in London many decades afterwards, when I was a cabinet minister, I did it on Terence Ashton, who is actually the nephew of Eugene Ashton, who runs Jonathan Ball Publishers. So that's where there was a connection. He was not overtly and constantly asking after my parents, but it was very clear he was sympathetic and very privately supportive. And there were one or two other teachers like that as well. It was not demonstrative, it was not open, there was no kind of formal thing at all. And the head teacher at that time, who I think tried to model Pretoria Boys High on kind of an English private school, Desmond Abernethy, he was also privately understanding, but publicly and officially that was never demonstrated. So I was very fortunate in that respect. There was only one incident when a boy had a go at me, but that was pretty mild. He called me a communist, which is the favorite sort of swear word in those days for any anti-apartheid activist. But otherwise, and indeed at Hatfield Primary School, when my mum and dad started to get active, when they were put in jail and so on, before I went to Pretoria Boys High, there was never any antagonism from the teachers. My mum and dad didn't force themselves or their politics into the school in any way, but we could have actually had a much tougher time, and it was interesting that we didn't.
So there's a huge amount that I've got to canvas in a short period of time, so I need to move on and ask you this just before we get to the sports boycotts. I didn't realize until I read this book that, of course I realized about John Harris and about the implications for the Liberal Party, but it appears to me that, in a sense, you played quite a central role at the funeral or the commemoration, because nobody else could speak.
Yes, I mean, it's not something that I'd expected as a 15-year-old.
No, you were what, a 15-year-old child, whatever. I don't know how old you were at the time. Probably, 14, 15, I suppose.
I was 15 at the time of his funeral
yes.
and his hanging, but I was 14 at the time of his arrest. He was a family friend, a Liberal Party activist.
So you knew him?
I knew him, yes. And, my brother Tom and I used to talk cars to him and sport to him. He was a great enthusiast for sport, as well as, a colleague of my mum and dad's in the Liberal Party, and great fun to be with. So when he was arrested and charged with the bombing on Johannesburg railway station, which of course the bomb blew up contrary to what he wanted. He issued a 15-minute telephone warning, which was shown in court to have happened to newspapers and to the police. And there's evidence that John Foster, the Minister of Police at the time, and Van den Berg, I think it's H.J. Van den Berg, his head of security, deliberately ignored the warning because they preferred the bomb to go off. Anyway, so an old lady was killed, a number of people injured. The old lady's granddaughter was maimed, and so it cast a terrible shadow. And my parents, nevertheless, who disagreed fundamentally with John and other friends and activists who'd been in the African resistance movement, people like Hugh Lewin, for example, who was jailed and was a close family friend. So when he was hung, it was very, very traumatic. It was my mum and dad stood by his wife Anne and his tiny toddler baby David, despite the fact that they disagreed with what he'd done, and took an enormous lot of flack. And ultimately, I think that was the decisive thing. After being banned, then they restricted my dad from being able to work as an architect designing hospital laboratories, and they finally said to every architectural firm in Pretoria, in the Pretoria municipal area, and his banning order meant he couldn't leave it and couldn't get permission to go and find work elsewhere, that we had to leave the country in 1966. And maybe that would have happened anyway, but because my parents were so prominent in Pretoria. But it was the John Harris incident that actually culminated in my dad being deprived of a living. But when he was hung, the funeral was held shortly afterwards, and the night before, my dad was refused permission. It was typical behavior by the special branch. They could have told him days before, the date having long been fixed, that he couldn't read out the funeral address. It wasn't an oration, it was just a prepared order of service in a way, like when to sing hymns, when to sing We Shall Overcome, and so forth. John was not religious at all. He was an atheist and didn't have a conversion on the gallows, a priest confirmed. So it was a pretty traumatic affair in all of our lives, and in my young life at that time as well.
So when you get to England, I mean, well, two things, I suppose. Firstly, you leave. Did you assume? I mean, you could never have dreamt one day that that you'd be Lord Peter Hain and that you'd have been a cabinet minister. I mean, that would have been obvious. Well, it's even more bizarre than the fact that I would have thought I'd ever be a judge. But that's another matter. Not about me. We talk about you. But did you think then this will be a temporary thing? I will be back. This is my country.
No, my dad, who was very, very strategic in his thinking and very hard-headed, though had tremendous humanity and warmth as an individual, he said to all of us, look, the battle against apartheid is going to take a long time to win. We will win it eventually, but we're not going back. We've got to make a new life. And that was instilled in all of us, me maybe more. I think my two younger sisters and my younger brother had a much tougher time than me. I got stuck into school and I didn't get into the sort of, the London scene in the 60s, which was a kind of, hippie type of lots of drugs being done and free sex and all of that. I was a boring sod, I'm afraid, who got involved in school and sport and politics. So I had no idea. I didn't know that I'd end up a few years after coming into exile in 1969-70 leading a campaign to disrupt the Springboks and to stop the 1970 cricket tour. I had no idea I'd be doing that. Still less to becoming an MP a few decades later, still less to becoming a cabinet minister, and the thought of becoming a lord would have probably appalled the young Peter Hain in the late 1960s.
In fairness to you, I should place on record that you do point out to Ellie Miliband in the book that you thought the Lords should be abolished, but perhaps I'll get there later.
Reformed.
Yes,
elected,
okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
Can I ask you though, that it does seem to me what is so fascinating is it is true that younger people, my children's generation, probably wouldn't know this unless they knew history. But your entire career, in a way, is turbocharged through South Africa. So you leave South Africa, but South Africa doesn't leave you because central to your early political life is this extraordinary campaign in favor of a sports boycott. And so what intrigued me was that you left, but the passion to do something about South Africa never left you.
No, and that was imbibed in me really, initially by my parents and my upbringing. And I was, as I've indicated earlier, I'm a sports fanatic. You'll be very disappointed to have confirmed that I'm a Chelsea fan.
Yes, I thought about not actually doing this interview as being a Manchester United fanatic, but be that as it may. If you were Liverpool, I might have drawn the line. But
right, okay, yes. I might have as well if I'd known you were a Man United supporter.
Yeah.
But so I was more interested. I mean, I was excited, and my brother Tom was as well, to be able to go to Stamford Bridge, Chelsea's ground, because this was, soccer was something we listened to on the World Service on the Saturday afternoon, and sometimes it was Chelsea playing, which is how we decided to become Chelsea supporters, by the way, because a friend put us up to stay with him initially, and his house was relatively near Stamford Bridge. But we were more interested in going around to see the West Indies play England, and of course to see Basil d'Oliveira, the great South African coloured cricketer, who couldn't play for his own country and had to play and ended up playing for England and one of the top England players at that time. So I was more interested in sport, but then gradually I followed my mum and dad into the British anti-apartheid movement, became involved in the radical politics of that era, student sit-ins and anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, and of course marches against apartheid and the Ian Smith illegal rebellion in the old Rhodesia. Got very involved in all of that, but sport was still my passion. And a lot of other anti-apartheid activists didn't understand why sport was so important to white South Africans. I knew because I was one by upbringing. And so when Basil d'Oliveira when he was selected to play for England, and I tell the story in the Pretoria Boy for those who aren't aware of it in a compressed way, he was selected to play for England in touring South Africa in 1968. And then John Vorster, the then Prime Minister, actually banned the tour because it included d'Oliveira, and he would have been such an embarrassment to have somebody who wasn't white, but who was a South African, playing for England against South Africa. I mean, that would have been exposed the whole, both the absurdity and the horror of sports apartheid. And then despite that, a few months later, Dennis, the English cricket authorities in January 1969 invite white South Africa to tour in 1970. And I remember just being so angry about it and issuing a media statement and getting all my friends and fellow activists to join me and saying, we stop that tour. And that was the first time direct action on a national scale had been used in sport in Britain.
But I mean, you're quite right about Basil d'Oliveira. I mean, he scored 158 against the very fine West Indian attack just before. Suddenly, the English decide they want Tom Cartwright there, which is ridiculous. Right. And I think the most funny part about it, which is terribly tragic, but it was funny, that Vorster said that that when d'Oliveira came into the side, they'd replaced Tom Cartwright, an all-rounder, with Basil d'Oliveira, batsman. I thought he knew nothing about cricket. Exactly. He would say that. I mean,
but d'Oliveira was a swing bowler as well, and took
he was. Took wickets. But what I was going to ask you was, I mean, what sort of gave you the impetus started with the Springbok rugby tour. It wasn't the cricket tour. It was the earlier Springbok rugby.
We
tour.
Decided to form the Stop the 70 Tour Committee.
Yeah,
I came up with the name because it was the 1970 cricket tour.
You 19 at the time, am I right?
I was 19, yes. And Dennis Brutus.
How the hell did you work this all out at the time? I mean, it's a pretty sophisticated strategy.
I was encouraged by Dennis Brutus, who of course served on Robben Island, was chair of the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, in which John Harris succeeded him as chair, by the way, when Dennis Brutus was banned and in prison. And Christa Broglie, a former weightlifting champion of South Africa, who'd been forced into exile through the sports struggle. And they must have seen this young, kind of vigorous activist, age 19, and thought they better kind of sort him out. And they encouraged me. And they were the ones, it was Dennis who said, no, why don't you lead this campaign? I came up with the idea that we should actually disrupt the tour, because the anti-apartheid movement, to its great credit, and was the strongest anti-apartheid movement London-based in the whole of the world, And of course, Oliver Tambo was based in London as well, leading the ANC and the wider anti-apartheid international struggle. The anti-apartheid movements had previously held up banners and organized petitions and lobbied the cricket authorities and the rugby authorities outside Twickenham, outside Lord's cricket ground and so on, not to play white South Africa. But we were treated with patronizing disdain. It was like a dialogue of the deaf, and continued to be, by the way. So I thought, well, okay, we can't continue like this forever. Let's run on the pitch. Not attack anybody, not be violent, non-violent direct action in a Gandhian style, if you like, the style of the suffragettes and the early trade unionists in Britain fighting for their rights. Non-violent, but physically interpose ourselves on the pitch and stop play. So that was where the idea came from. And as I said earlier, it was a very radical period, exciting period of youth radicalism in not just Britain, but Germany and France and America, of course, as well at that time. The civil rights movements, Martin Luther King, and so on. So that was the atmosphere. I came up with the idea, but it was Dennis Brutus and Christa Broglie who encouraged me to actually be the person who suddenly found myself chairing this national campaign, which took off like a rocket.
And the interesting part about the book, I mean, it's absolutely true that at that particular point in time, you certainly were public enemy number one with all the sports people. I certainly accept that, no doubt. I
still have white South Africans who tell me they hated me, by the way.
Yeah, they
haven't stopped hating me.
Yeah, because we were being denied our rightful claim to sport. How much support did you have in the British population at that point in time, did you feel? Or were you getting a hell of a lot of threats?
Yes, a lot of threats, physical threats of various kinds, but also a lot of antagonism. I mean, I was notorious at that time, less notorious than amongst white South Africans, but pretty notorious because I was doing something that was a taboo, interfering with sport, and a lot of people couldn't understand it. You're bringing politics into sport, they continuously said. No, I said, it's apartheid, the apartheid government that brings politics into sport, that banned an England team for playing because of D'Oliveira. And D'Oliveira, by the way, was very, very important at that whole incident in swinging a bit of middle ground towards, as running a militant campaign. And I make this point in Pretoria, boy, you can't just have a militant campaign without a hinterland and a spectrum of support. So the anti-apartheid movement was very important in all of this. The Fair Cricket campaign, headed by former England cricketer David Shepherd, Bishop Shepherd, was very important as well. You needed a hinterland of support. But yes, it was. I was pretty notorious, and various people urged me to be prosecuted, which I eventually was.
And I want to talk to you about that in a moment.
Yeah.
But before I do, because we could talk about this for the whole program, it's fascinating. But I wanted to ask you, before I get back to the prosecution, something that happened a few years later when Donnie Craven pitched up to meet you. I didn't know that until I read your book. I mean, how did you, just give me some sense of what was going on then?
Well, once we stopped the 1970 cricket tour, it was cancelled because we'd have wrecked it and it became an international controversy. Once that cricket tour was stopped, the same year the Olympics, white South Africa was banned from the Olympics. One by one, international support, largely as a result of SANROC, South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, led by Christa Broglie and Dennis Brutus and later Sam Ramzani, resulted in white South Africa being excluded from virtually all international sport. That became a big issue in South Africa. And so they came up with all sorts of ruses to try and, decorate an apartheid sports structure with some black teams allowed to play international teams, but they could only be all black or all colored or all Indian or all white. They couldn't be non-racial. And there were all these because they were desperate to get back in, and it wasn't working. There were a few rebel tours, but it wasn't working. The British Lions came out in 1974, but they couldn't tour. And suddenly, in early 1977, 7 years after we'd stopped the cricket tour, after I'd been dubbed public enemy #1, and other things had happened to me, including getting a letter bomb that should have assassinated me like it did other anti-apartheid figures across the world. I suddenly get this phone call at my home number, which wasn't publicly listed. It's Darnie Craven on the line wanting to meet me. Anyway, he came to our small flat with my tiny little son Sam scurrying around, age less than a year, crawling about. Craven he came in very brisk and, almost into the lion's den, and looking like a rugby forward about to barge me over. But he was very courteous as well. And gradually we talked a bit, and he said, why do you hate rugby? And I explained I didn't hate rugby. I hated apartheid rugby. And and I had thought that something like this might happen. So I'd come up with a list of reforms to take out apartheid from sport. It was a bit absurd, of course, but the idea that you could, because I kept saying, why don't you reform sport? Why don't you make rugby non-racial? Why don't you get the government to abolish the pass laws for sport? So, black sports people playing at away games didn't need to apply for permission. Now, all of that was a bit absurd in a way, but what it did do is put pressure on him and on others to actually come to terms with the fact that they had to reform sport. It wasn't just a political matter. Anyway, we talked about all of this, and he seemed to be quite taken with the idea, and I presented him with a list of reforms that were needed, like, abolishing the liquor and licensing laws, allowing black and white spectators to drink together, abolishing segregation in grounds, and all of this. I didn't expect it to ever happen, Dennis, and it didn't happen. But the point was, he then went back home and said he was going to present it to Sports Minister Piet Koornhof, which he did and was rebuffed. So that's that story.
It's a fascinating, all sorts of reasons, but I want to come back to the fact that you had 2 prosecutions against you, both of which emanated from this. The first by Francis Benyon, and then the second, the Barclays Bank story. And I'm just intrigued. These were basically put-up jobs by South African security police.
Well, in the case of the bank theft, certainly.
Definitely.
In October 1975. In the case of the conspiracy prosecution, there was an eccentric barrister called Francis Benyon. There have been calls from the shadow Conservative Attorney General, who subsequently became Attorney General, Sir Peter Rawlinson, when Edward Heath won the election. It had been a Labour government up until then, in June 1970, for me to be prosecuted. So it was in the ether. And Benyon decided he'd mount a private prosecution, and you'll understand better than me that bringing a private prosecution for a criminal offence, in this case a very serious criminal offence of conspiracy, which would have certainly have jailed me. Normally that didn't happen, but there was this eccentric provision in English law that allowed for a private prosecution to be brought. And the result of it was that I landed up on a month-long trial in the Old Bailey, and my QC said to me, it looks like the judge wants to send you to jail as an exemplary sentence for organizing this non-violent direct action, but stopping the tour because this is against the law and blah, blah, blah. But it was financed from South Africa. There were collection boxes in pubs, in bars. There were also collection boxes in collections taken in the South African civil service at the time, and other forms of finance came from South Africa for that. I was eventually acquitted of all the main charges, but on a hung verdict after, 8 hours waiting for the verdict.
Just out of interest, the judge that you portray in that case was unbelievably prejudiced towards you from my reading of your account, and I have no reason to disbelieve you at all. I wondered whether, when you became a cabinet minister and were in the Blair cabinet, whether your experience would have inspired you to think about reform of judicial appointment.
Well, we did bring in, as a Labour government, a much more independent system of judicial appointments. And of course, set up the Supreme Court, as you know. Under Tony Blair. I think one of his very important reforms took it out of the kind of House of Lords. But I didn't really have any responsibilities for judicial reform in my 12-year government career. So I had thought a lot about it. And in fact, as a result of the conspiracy case, my conspiracy case and others at the time, the law on conspiracy was eventually reformed. Because, you know, I was charged, well, we can get into the detail of it. I was charged with about 900 offences, individual offences under 4 conspiracy counts, the length and breadth of the British Isles. I mean, it was absurd, conspiring with others unknown. Many of them were known. So, but the law was reformed to stop that happening. And in the case of the bank theft, when I was arrested in October 1975, I didn't know that a branch of Barclays Bank near my home in southwest London had been robbed. And there were actually 2 Barclays Bank branches, a couple of 100 meters apart from each other in the other ends of the high streets. I didn't know about the bank theft had been committed. I didn't even know which branch of Barclays, one of which I demonstrated out, which turned out because we were campaigning for Barclays to disinvest from South Africa, which the British anti-apartheid movement eventually won on. So it was a Kafkaesque experience. But again, I landed up in the Old Bailey for 2 weeks trial, and again on a majority verdict only, acquitted, because it was. And again, the identification evidence law on it was reformed because the fingerprint on the banknotes, which was conveniently thrown back by the South African agent who committed the theft.
Did we ever discover who that was, by the way?
No. I tried to, after the transformation, to find out, but a lot of records.
The point about files being destroyed is something which I knew about because
I bet,
we were very keen to get files of what they might have had in us, and they were gone. But I wanted to ask you: was Barclays involved in that then?
No.
Were they in on the deal? No,
I don't think so at all. In fact, some of the bank staff, when I was put on an identification parade in absurd circumstances, after the police had leaked my arrest, and it was front page news, and there was a picture of me on the London evening paper saying Peter Hain due to appear on an identification parade this afternoon. And it emerged in court that the bank staff in Barclays Bank had been reading the newspaper before they came down the line to see whether I was the thief. And no, I don't think it was a put-up job at all involving Barclays, because some of the bank staff actually said I wasn't. It was the cashier who did. And the law was reformed because the fingerprint was not mine on the banknotes thrown back. It was a fresh fingerprint, but it was not mine, and they still charged me.
And you also had another judge who was who certainly didn't like you, put it mildly.
Who was a member of the MCC.
Well, there you are. That's the whole judicial background is very important.
Alan King Hamilton.
I've got to move on because I see we have 20 minutes left, and I wanted to actually come to the present day. There's so much we could speak about, and I'm glossing over a whole lot. But perhaps 2 final questions before I ask you about your assessment of South Africa today and what you've said about the Guptas. Your parents were Liberal Party, and you joined the Liberal Party. How did you land up there in the Labour Party?
Well, I joined the Young Liberals, who were very radical at the time.
Okay.
Libertarian socialists, not states nationalization, everything, the state running everything socialists. And I'm still a libertarian socialist. And then I realized, the Liberal Party, as I ceased to be young, was not really my home. I joined the Labour Party in 1977, but, you asked me right at the beginning of this conversation, did I ever expect to end up politically where I did? Senior positions, a member of the Queen's Privy Council and all that kind of thing. When I joined the Labour Party in 1977, I worked, my first job on leaving university was in the trade union movement for the Communication and Postal Workers Union. No, I didn't have any thoughts of being an MP, but it was the Labour Party was increasingly attractive to me at the time, whereas in the late 60s it had seemed it was in government, it seemed too moderate, to be frank.
So moving on, Peter, you document in the latter part of your book is very, very interesting, and I had some personal knowledge of this for reasons that work in the Treasury, is you got through a whistleblower to know a lot about, well, quite a bit about what was going on with regard to the Guptas, etc. You document this and you make these speeches in the House of Lords. And you then say that, you were trying to press the government to do more, and it didn't. Can you explain why you think they were so tardy about not pursuing the Guptas and the money, when you rightly point out in your book?
The South African government or the British government?
Well, I suppose both.
Both, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was asked by senior members in the ANC, and I explain this to expose the international dimension. The Daily Maverick, and I'm honoured to be on this webinar because I think it's a great newspaper, news online news sheet, was exposing through Anama Bungani and other news outlets in South Africa were exposing the Zupta conspiracy inside the country. But the international dimension, including the money laundering and the involvement of international corporates, global corporates in all of this, had not been exposed. So that was what I was asked to do. And I was supplied by draft speeches. I said, look, I don't have the ability to research all of this myself. I'm on my own in the House of Lords. I have no research capacity. I need you as the experts, if you can find people, and people were found. I refer to a deep throat source. I've never identified who she or he is, or whether it's just one person or more, who supplied me on an encrypted basis with the drafts. So it was, and I actually had the identification numbers of all the Guptas, all their associates, all the Zuma family, and all of their companies. So it was very, it was gold dust, really. And that is what I used to do this. And in terms of the British government, they were not hostile at all. They couldn't be, after all. But they were pretty slow. Years later, we finally got Majinsky-type sanctions placed on the Gupta brothers, and I think one of their associates. But that's, it's a bit after the horse has bolted. HSBC, Standard Chartered, Bank of Baroda, the principal global banks involved, they were the conduits in the main for the money to come out of Johannesburg, through Dubai or through Hong Kong. And when I gave evidence to the Zondo Commission, and I described this in the Pretoria Boy, to summarize what I was arguing. Yes. And you'll know that probably that when you submit written evidence to the Zondo Commission, and I submitted 10,000 words of detailed evidence on the international dimension, they then have to pass it around, it's the protocol, and rightly so, to any of the banks named in this case or the individual's name. Standard Chartered then sort of had the temerity to say, we think Lord Hain's being unfair because we're the Johannesburg, South African end of it. We sent the money, the Gupta money, through to Dubai, but Dubai is a different jurisdiction. It's nothing to do with us, what happened after that. Come on, these are international banks. They have one digital pipeline from Joburg through to Dubai or Hong Kong or London. These billions of rand were sent through these banks, which present themselves as respectable global corporates. I mean, they were up to their necks in money laundering. I don't say that lightly at all. They were, and they admitted their responsibility. They did nothing at all to actually stop it. And the horses are long bolted before they finally admitted their complicity. And then when I asked them, when they beat a path to my door in the House of Lords and asked to see me, their global heads, many of them flown in from New York and so on, in the case of KPMG and McKinsey, who are also complicit in all of this, as we know. I said, well, look, why don't you cooperate? Why don't you reveal to investigators, the way the Guptas did this? They said, oh, well, that's client confidentiality. We can't do that. To which my reply is, you and I, as honest citizens and people, watching this and taking part in this webinar, we're entitled to client confidentiality, quite right. But when it's protecting international criminals, robbing, in this case, South African taxpayers of precious billions, you can't, it just seems to me to be indefensible to give that kind of excuse.
But you also seem to suggest in your book, and I certainly recommend the whole book, but that chapter is particularly interesting because it's present to today, that you had spoken to the authorities, and I understand from the book that Shamila Bataille, the National Director of Public Prosecutions, and Willie Hofmeyr showed on your description enthusiasm for pursuing this. But somehow it never got done. There was not enough energy in the South African government to do what should have been done.
Well, I introduced to the NPA leadership, Willie Hofmeyr and Shamila, who were very supportive and sympathetic. Yes. I introduced some people who'd formed an informal partnership of asset tracers. Their profession, lawyers and forensic accountants, was asset tracing, finding the looted money and bringing it back. And they were funded, and they had funding in place from a US-based risk investment fund that put up the money, because it's very expensive. You'll probably know from your expert experience in all of this territory. It's very expensive to actually trace the money when it's gone international. Yeah. But it can be done. And these very same people were working for the Nigerian government, pursuing a oil-related looting, which I think was over $1 billion, and had already recovered at the time I was speaking to ministers in the South African government and senior NPA officials and senior Treasury officials as well, explaining that actually, you could put together, and the South African government wouldn't cost them anything because it's risk funded, but to take that risk, the investment fund needed a return of the returned money to be negotiated. Now, this seemed to me like a no-brainer, and everybody I spoke to said it's a no-brainer, but it's never been done before. You need ministerial clearance. In the case of the NPA, to be fair, the leadership were absolutely, up to their eyes in trying to sort it out and get the criminals prosecuted, and that was very difficult for the reasons we all know. And so nothing has happened. And I put it down to less resistance and unwillingness to do it than just, a kind of sclerosis in the government machine, which I think affects a lot of policy at the present time, including under the President Cyril Ramaphosa, whom I really admire and is in the Mandela tradition. But the government is pretty sclerotic.
That's what you say. That's what you say. For all the good intentions of President Ramaphosa, South Africa's government is being gripped by a frustrating sclerosis. Can you explain that at all? I mean, you're right. Yesterday, the figures came out showing, unemployment on the expanded definition over 40%. We all know that. Why is it, in your view, and you've been in government, that we just don't seem to be able? I mean, you probably speak to people within the government more than I do. So the question is, why? What is going on here? Why is there the sclerosis, in your view?
Well, there is a background, of course, of the incredible millstone of apartheid. Yeah. And then there's the additional but smaller but important millstone of the Zuma 10 years and the corruption and the cronyism and the dysfunctional nature of the state. I mean, I think the Zuma period in the main is very serious, not just for the looting and the corruption, but how you turn, world-class agencies like the South African Revenue Service into a dysfunctional organization from which it attempts to be rescued now. And the same for, public utilities like Eskom, state-owned enterprises, and so on, so that they actually become a drain on the taxpayer. South African Airways, a drain on the taxpayer, instead of, a successful commercial airline as it once was. So I think it's the dismembering of the state and the degree of dysfunction that is now at its heart that is really, really serious. And in the case of the presidency and government ministers, it's a lack of capacity. And Dennis, I've seen this myself, in much more advantageous circumstances of a long-established system of a professional civil service in Britain as a cabinet minister. Getting anything done is really, really hard. People say, this minister's failing to do, and in South Africa they have a go at the president, but it's really hard. What the civil service loves doing, what government ministers love doing, and they get into this kind of frame of mind. They love producing papers or setting up task forces or new, infrastructure, in President Ramaphosa's case, commissions and all of that. Great. What's the output? There's a lot of process in government. There's often very little output. Businesses can't survive. Organizations can't survive without output. So I think that's at the root of it. But there's then this additional sclerosis from, the cronyism, the incompetence, still the civils in public administration. There's some fine officials, as I say in my book, but there's also some incompetent and corrupt ones. And it's this cumulative experience that I think is stopping, just the small example, and I'm sure there are many others. What infrastructure projects have actually come from the commission that Rolf Meyer, and I'm a big admirer of his, to his credit, chairs, and credit of the president he set it up. What has actually happened? How many hospitals have been built? How many, power stations are being built? How many, vital infrastructure, IT infrastructure being built? What preparations are being made for artificial intelligence, which could be a massive dent on employment again in South Africa, as you've just said, it's got one of the worst employment rates in the world, unemployment rates in the world. It is frustrating because it's still an amazing country. In many respects, South Africa's still got a first world infrastructure but it's deteriorating and has deteriorated badly in a developing world population.
So can I then ask you, you conclude your book about the future. What is your view about South Africa's future as you look at it?
Well, I'm still optimistic because I think it's a great country and they've got fantastic people. I mentioned, I teach at Pretoria University's Gibbs Business School in Johannesburg, and I did before that teach at Wits Business School. And they're incredibly bright MBA students that I've been teaching on leadership and negotiating skills and so on. This is the future of the country. There's tremendous talent out there waiting to be released with decent leadership. And the ANC's got to start providing it or it will die, I say. So I'm still optimistic, but, it does depend on economic transformation. I don't mean the kind of radical economic transformation of the Zuma rights and the EFF, because it's actually transformation for themselves and new elites, maybe with a different skin color from the old white elites under apartheid and that still exists, but is not really a genuine transformation that will spread wealth and income and opportunity in the way that I want to see. And as a Labour politician in Britain have continuously campaigned for. So there's a lot still to be done. And, it is time, the bell is tolling and urgent action is needed to begin the process of growing the economy first. There's no point just redistributing when the economy has been shrinking in real terms, the population growth.
So the question I suppose, so, some of us who obviously have the privilege of working in British governments have an image of your civil service shaped by yes minister and yes prime minister.
There's a lot of that.
yeah. Even though Sir Humphrey, of course, spent 20 years of his own life in South Africa, the actor, of course. But in South Africa, Peter, we've got cadre deployment. In other words, I'm not sure that it's the people who've been in the civil service for 40 years who spend their lives trying to essentially prevent ministers from doing anything. We've appointed people, and we don't seem to stop doing that, who are essentially connected to the party. Surely that's where it's got to stop. And we just, your point, if I can just finish, your point about talented people, and particularly, to be honest, talented black people around.
Majority of the students I teach, great majority of black.
I teach at 3 universities, UCT, UWC, and WITS, and I can testify to the fact that we have fantastic talent. And I know that for years we've had that because I've been teaching for so long. But somehow, because we've got this idea of cadre deployment, we don't get those talented people into where they should be.
Well, I do think South African politics is, reaching a point, if it not long reached it, where it needs fundamental reform. I worry about the merging of party and state, and you in a sense questioning me about that in the Carter deployment. I had two special advisors as a cabinet minister. The Prime Minister in Britain has more special advisors. They are political appointees, but they are a tiny number of people, and they have to abide by the civil service code of conduct. They become civil servants, actually, but they are political appointees. But I don't like the system whereby you kind of bring your own whole team in, and they act as your kind of cronies and so forth. I don't think it works. You lose institutional memory, you lose capacity actually to deliver. And I think the merger of the party and state, which is quite considerable in South Africa, it is almost indivisible in Zimbabwe, for example, and we see how disastrous that has been, a one-party state there. You've got to address that. You've got to have a much more independent, flourishing, professional civil service with political appointees, but, you know, the one or twos rather than the thousands or the hundreds. And I think also myself that you know, you need a decent opposition, and I'm afraid I'm pretty trenchant about the DA and the EFF in providing any sort of serious opposition. Governments, I've been a government minister. You've got to fear the prospect of losing to keep you on your toes. That's an essential kind of democratic principle. In South Africa, we don't have that at the moment because of the ANC's ascendancy, and I've been a long-term ANC supporter, and the failure to have a decent opposition currently, which is desperately needed.
So a sort of theme that coming through some of the chat line, which I've been trying to capture just a little bit, but let me put this to you, is a lot of people sort of asking in various forms the following. If you knew then what you know now about the ANC, would you have continued to support them?
Yes, I would have done. I didn't realize the extent of the degeneration and corruption until I began to come back to South Africa much more from 2015 afterwards, teaching particularly. I didn't realize it. No, I mean, I think, you know, the ANC of Mandela and Sisulu and Tambo and Kathrada and Mlangeni and Mbeki was a fantastic ANC, and South Africa was very, very lucky to have had it. Very lucky, frankly, or you would not have had the relatively smooth transformation that you finally did get between 1990 and 1994. But, you know, and Mandela started predicting it. He started talking about corruption while he was president, didn't he? You know, he had the foresight. There is a thing about dominant parties in Eastern Europe from that tradition of liberation and, you know, very centralized parties actually going bad and becoming corrupt. Ronnie Kasrils, for example, discusses this in his book about Zuma and himself, who'd both been in the underground together.
Yeah.
So it's not an original point, but it's something that I think's got to be addressed. And I think the ANC has got to be seriously reformed. I don't think it can survive in the way that it is, and nor do I think the South African government can succeed.
There are lots of points we could take from that, but I don't have time. I also don't have time to talk to you about Zimbabwe, but that's another matter. But I want to just finally ask you this. Very early in the book, you say, so who do you want to win, Peter, the Springboks or England? And you say Wales. And I'm fascinated by that, Peter, and I'll tell you why. Because Roger Cohen, the New York Times columnist who was born in South Africa, wrote a book in which he talks about home being those kind of really impressionable moments. And I think he regards St. James at Christmas holidays as being home. Where is home for you? Because you speak with great passion about South Africa and it shaped your life, even when you left it.
Well, home is Wales, and home has been Wales for 30 years now, which is more, you know, is nearly half my life, and that's why I support Wales. But you know, a lot of my heart is still in South Africa, as you can probably tell, and that was the point of the Pretoria boy. And you know, my parents sacrificed a lot to do what they did. They always maintained they never sacrificed anything like, you know, the Mandelas and the many others, black activists who were tortured and imprisoned and assassinated. and they didn't, but they sacrificed a lot. And, I still care about that. And I don't want to see those values of Mandela and Tambo and down the food chain, my mom and dad, betrayed. I want to see them, exalted in a continuing building of a new South Africa, which was always the vision of 1994.
Well, I'm afraid I've come to the end of our time. I want to thank you enormously for this. I probably had another hour of questions, but I'm not going to be able to do that. But here's the book. I gather you can buy this on the webinar, and if not, you should buy it anyway from the book side. There you've got it, so we both have it. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and it brought back a whole host of very important memories. Peter Hain, thank you very much, and I hope everybody does read this book.
Thank you, and thank you for Daily Maverick for having me on.
Yeah, pleasure.
Bye, everyone.